Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And there's still time to win one of our merch bundles signed by Alastair and me if you switch energy suppliers to Fuse by the end of January.
All you got to do is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics to sign up. And merch on no merch, it is worth considering switching to Fuse. They're a green electricity supplier generating power from their own solar and wind farms, and they invest 100% of profits into building more renewables.
Their tariffs are cheaper than any of the big six competitors, so you'll still be saving money, even though the price cap has gone up. And their customer service is excellent. Fuse offer 24/7 support and promise they'll answer any query within a minute on the Fuse app.
So download it now, use the referral code politics after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for terms and conditions and to learn all you need to know.
Welcome to the Rest is Politics question time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. And we ended the main podcast, Rory, by saying we were going to talk about Serbia on question time. And we have had questions about Serbia. And maybe the best one, this is one from Marco. Please, can you explain what's going on with the student protests in Serbia? These are big, these protests. Have you been following this?
Yes, I have. And I think there's a couple of interesting things going on. But maybe tell us first about the protests themselves, and then maybe we can go back to why Serbia matters and what's going on in Serbia more fully.
So essentially what's happened is that an awning at a railway station crashed. 14 people were killed instantly. This is in a place called Novi Sad. 14 people killed, 3 others severely injured, and a 15th person has died since. And the accusation is that the reason was shoddy building work because of corrupt deals, and the public have got very, very, very angry about it. So what's happened, these student protests that are taking all sorts of different forms and quite interesting, a bit like some of the protests that we've seen here. No leader of the protest movement, lots of democracy within the protest movement. They have votes about what to do next and where to protest and how to protest and so forth. And actually Alexander Vučić, the president, who's got this reputation as a very strongman leader, follows a lot of the kind of the Putin way of doing things, feels like he's very much on the back foot. He's been making all sorts of offers. He's talking about sort of loans that can be done for students who are struggling with their finances. Also, they've been demanding that all the papers related to these contracts are published. Some of them have been. They're now going through them all really, really in fine detail and demanding more. And so this is a very, very interesting protest movement, which does seem to have caught them pretty much on the back foot.
And the reason, obviously, why it matters is Serbia was right at the center of the Balkan Wars. And there in the central Yugoslavia, as it splintered apart, and as Croatia and Bosnia, Montenegro, Slovenia all broke away, North Macedonia. And the question of what happens in Serbia really matters, because with Trump coming in and suggesting he doesn't really care about countries breaking national borders and reinforcing nationalist rhetoric, there is the fact of repeated statements by Vučić, who is the Serbian leader, about his claims to re-annex northern Kosovo, which became de facto independent from Serbia after the Kosovo Wars. And in order to do that, he is relying on about 50,000 Serbs in northern Kosovo who have withdrawn from the Kosovar institutions. They're refusing to vote, refusing to participate in the police. And in these demonstrations, some of the people demonstrating are actually further to the right than Vučić. There's a lot of complicated things going on. You can't see European flags, for example, in these demonstrations. There are people protesting against the lithium mines in Serbia, which Germany wants Serbia to invest in. And we now also have in Croatia the election of a very, very eccentric far-right populist who was previously the prime minister, now back as president, Zoran Milanovic. And I just don't know quite where this happens. You had that lovely moment in yesterday's podcast where you talked about how quickly things can change in 10 years. Of the scenarios we might look at, there is a very likely scenario that we end up back in conflict in the Balkans again. And why will it happen? It will happen, and I suppose this is probably true in Northern Ireland. I think in 1967, 68, nobody predicted that Northern Ireland would collapse in the way that it did. And it can happen very unexpectedly. If Vucic starts threatening Northern Kosovo or Republika Srpska, there are now 200,000 Bosniak Muslims now scattered back and living within Republika Srpska. Mosques are being rebuilt there. Refugees have returned. If they start arming themselves because they're worried that this thing is going to start off again, you get the tit for tat taking off.
Is that right, that some of these are the far right that are protesting? So when we think of, is this me sort of, when I think of students, I'm assuming we're talking here about broadly anti-government because they're more to the left. Is that wrong?
I think some of these people are to the right, and some of these people are anti-European, and some of these people are curiously more pro-Putin than Vucic. I mean, it's one of these situations where you sense a bit like you've pointed out with Putin that however right-wing he is, there are people further to his right, and some people are saying Vucic hasn't gone far enough in defending Serb interests. He's also got another problem, which is really interesting. Europe has refused to impose sanctions on Serbia, but the US now has. Yeah. The US has now imposed really strong sanctions to try to force Serbia to leave the Gazprom, the Russian state gas company, investment in Serbia. And just at the moment as that's crippling energy supplies for Serbia, Azerbaijan has announced it's no longer going to be providing gas to Serbia, possibly because it's had its arm twisted by Russia. So Serbia, whose economy is in trouble, whose population is collapsing, it's losing a lot of young university-educated people. Almost everybody in Serbia gives the impression that they want to kind of move to Germany, is finding itself facing big energy problems. And this is where the European Union needs to step up, to keep coming back to this, that if we're to avoid a war in the Balkans, we need to restart engagement and give, ultimately in the long term, political hope to countries like Serbia that they have a future. Otherwise, we're going to get into a dark place.
One of the factors in this, the railway renovation that's being done with Serbia, the deal that was done was with Chinese firms. So whether that is what sort of fans, if you're saying that nationalism is involved in this, the students that I've seen being interviewed are very much what I would identify as kind of traditional, quite left-wing students who are basically saying we're fed up of corruption, we're fed up of a government that is, basically just expects the people to do as they're told the whole time. And they are, they are definitely having an impact. And I guess the point that you're making in relation to linking this to Kosovo is you're thinking that what sometimes leaders do when they're under pressure over an unrelated issue, they go to the issue that they know will always fire up their nationalist base.
Particularly, I think, in the case of Serbia, with the Trump government coming in and Trump signaling that he doesn't have much sympathy for all these old international rules. I mean, if a conflict were to start again in the Balkans, this time the US is very unlikely to participate. And a loss of the security infrastructure was based on US intelligence, small number of US troops, British presence. Britain was quite important in KFOR. I mean, you were right there on the ground during the initial Kosovo intervention. So it's one of these things that's worth watching. It doesn't mean that we can say that there's any more than a 20-30% chance of it happening, or even be that precise about what the chance of something like this is happening is. But in all the risks we're looking at around the world, this matters. And it's odd because if you go to Mostar, which is in the old sort of Croatian, Bosnian disputed areas of Bosnia, it's remarkably successful. There's a good mayor. You can go there. He's not traveling around with bodyguards. There's a sense the institutions are working. As I say, you've had 200,000 Muslim refugees returning to Republika Srpska. So there's a lot of positive stuff on the ground, but it's fragile. It's fragile.
Yeah.
As I suppose in the same way, Northern Ireland was still pretty fragile after the Good Friday Agreement, and in some ways may still be. So, Alastair, here we are. This is a very good question for you. It's from a man called Tom Holland, who I believe presents a podcast called The Rest is History.
I have heard of it. He may have had a role in establishing The Rest is Politics.
Yeah, that's the guy, the very same guy. Spider-Man himself. So, question particularly for Alastair.
Oh.
Because I always look to him for an insider's perspective on the government's thinking.
Oh, good luck with that.
What justification could there possibly be for Bridget Phillipson cancelling the Latin Excellence Programme? An admirable initiative which over the past couple of years has been funding over 8,000 students at a range of state schools across the country to study the languages Cicero and Virgil. Wasn't the government's justification for charging VAT on private schools that it would enable precisely such schemes to be funded? And why cancel the funding in the middle of the school year so that students hoping to do GCSE Latin this summer will be left without teaching in February? It seems to me both cruel and philistine, all the more so because the scheme only costs £1 million a year. But maybe I am missing something.
That's a very clever Tom Holland-esque. He doesn't think he's missing anything, does he? But I can't ever say that I recall the government saying that the justification for charging VAT in private schools was so that they could enable such schemes. And by the way, what he doesn't ask there is, what do we think? I actually think that one of the things I criticised the government I work for in relation to was the downgrading of modern languages. And I also I do actually think I did Latin at school, and I'm glad that I did Latin at school. And I think Latin was one of the reasons why I became interested in other languages. So I am also a fan of Latin. However, the thing I think he is missing is that this was one of the programs that the Conservative government had said they were going to extend without actually having any funding for it. And as I understand it, what the current government is doing is currently looking for some sort of philanthropist to fund this. Now, that is not a good way to fund an education system. I completely agree with that. But that is, I think, the thing that he might be missing. But I broadly, I do agree that if you're studying something and you're taking it through to GCSE, but then you're suddenly left with no teaching, then that is not a good thing.
I mean, is it that Latin is seen as a bit elitist because it's only 8,000 students? Bridget Phillipson doesn't really care. I mean, there's a part of her that was a bit like that. People listened to the leading interview, but there was a strange moment in that when I was challenging her around what would happen to children who left private schools and returned to the state sector. And she said, I don't care about the top 7%. I care about the other 93%. I mean, is there a bit of that going on in this?
I don't think so. I mean, but put it this way. I saw the reports about it and I actually started to make inquiries off my own back. And that is what they said. It says, look, this is not something we necessarily set out to do, but it sort of falls into it's one of those programs for which there was no proper funding going forward. And that's what they said to me. And I think, by the way, you're broadly, you're slightly exaggerating, I think, the tone of her interview. She didn't say, I don't care. I think she said that her focus was on the 93%. And so I think you should see this slightly separate from the VAT question. I think the answer to the VAT question, by the way, not least in part of the world where I live in, London, South East, there is plenty of capacity right now within the state sector. Lots of state schools are under pressure to shut just because of the falling rolls. But I think on this, I hope, and this is definitely what they were saying to me, and maybe Tom should, make contact with them and get in touch as to how he thinks it might work. But they are looking to keep this going, but not under the current spending envelope.
Right. Okay. Well, here's another one for you. Ruben Baxter. What does Alastair think about his old boss's comments on too many Brits self-diagnosing themselves with depression feels a bit off-brand and perhaps even dangerous in the current climate? Katrine, what do you think of the comments made by Tony Blair questioning the amount of money being spent on mental health and the perils of losing agency to govern your life when someone translates their problems into a mental health condition? As a fellow sufferer from depression, I wonder whether you would have advised him to address this issue differently. Can I just do the rather odd thing of sort of defending your boss for a second and then give you a chance to maybe disagree with him a little bit?
Yeah.
So Britain is facing an incredible explosion in the costs of disability benefits to the government. And there are nearly 900,000 people in Britain, almost 1 million people, who are out of the workforce. And part of this seems to be, I think, a 50% jump since COVID in the number of people who are being diagnosed and receiving benefits for different forms of conditions, when there's no particular reason to think that there's been a 50% increase in the number of people who are ill. And part of that is maybe that the Conservatives cut down very hard on other forms of benefits during their time in office, which made the disability benefits that much more lucrative, comparable to other forms of unemployment benefit. And that Rachel Reeves is facing having to manage a country where she needs to do two things. She needs to cut spending, and she needs to get people back into work and increase productivity. And she's going to struggle to do that. And I think this is what Tony Blair was trying to say, unless she can face up to the fact that something very strange is happening with disability benefits in Britain and the Disability Benefits Bill, which isn't happening anywhere else in Europe. Over to you.
I mean, it won't surprise you to know that I didn't actually like what he said. And I think it's a time when we're struggling to keep mental health properly on the NHS agenda, and I think we're going backwards in terms of the media debate around mental health as well. I'm not sure that it was very helpful. I'm going to read you a couple of things. The first is from page 7 of Tony's autobiography, where he says this. Now, he says very nice things about me. He says I was like a rock through the campaigns, blah, blah, blah. Then he goes on to say, in my experience, there are two types of crazy people. Those who are just crazy and are therefore dangerous, and those whose craziness lends them creativity, strength, ingenuity, and verve. Alastair was of the latter sort. The problem with them is that they can be mercurial, difficult, and on occasion erupt with damaging consequences. Above all, you must realize you can't tame them. You can reason with them, but the thing that makes them different and brilliant is the same thing that means they don't conform to normal, predictable modes of behavior. And I called him out for that at the time because I think I just think it misunderstands what we mean when we're talking about mental illness. Now, the other thing I want to read to you is the letter that Mind, a charity of which I'm an ambassador, sent to Tony. Dear Sir Tony Blair, we agree. We do need a proper conversation about mental health. Mental health problems are just as real as physical health problems, and we are in the middle of a mental health crisis. Change is possible and the solutions are out there, but we must start from a place of understanding and face the reality of what's happening. This is the key point. The reality is that mental health accounts for 20% of all health issues, but gets 10% of NHS funding. 2 million people in England currently sat on waiting lists for mental health support. Now, if we think that mental illness is, when you see somebody who's hearing voices, when you see somebody who's kind of on the streets and behaving strangely, then that's mental illness that, somebody who doesn't necessarily get mentally ill. And I think one of Tony's great strengths is a kind of optimism and a vibrancy in the way that he looks at life. But I think there's a danger that he doesn't understand that for a lot of people, depression is real, anxiety is real. And I think that particularly with the numbers now of people living in poverty and millions of people now that we would say are living in pretty difficult economic conditions, I think it's just too dismissive to say that these are people who are kind of self-diagnosing. So, yeah, it's very, very rare, as you know, Roy, that I criticize my old boss, but I didn't really like what he said there.
There's a very good book just coming out by Hilary Cottam on the work we need, and she would add into this that part of the reason why we have so many people not in work is that work in Britain is often less dignified, longer hours, more poorly paid, in worse and more demoralizing conditions than in other European countries. And that addressing this problem of getting people off benefits and into work is partly about increasing the quality of the work that we offer people compared to other countries. That there are many reasons why people are reluctant to go to work when the work they go into is depressing.
But also I think you have to, there may be all sorts of reasons for it, but it is a fact, it's an empirical fact that the number of young men taking their own lives is higher than it's ever been. You go into schools now and talk to teachers and head teachers about young girls and anxiety and social media. I mean, Tony's a massive believer in technology. We talked about AI on the main podcast. You and I support that notion that technology is going to lead to a lot of problem solving and solutions to challenges that the country and the world faces. But there's definitely something going on with young women that may relate to social media, may not. But that there is more anxiety out there. By the way, I saw an amazing speech the other day. I was just scrolling through, I think it was Instagram, and somebody posted the speech at Sandhurst of the outgoing head of the army who was speaking to officers. And if we can find it.
Is this General Patrick Sanders talking about unusual capacity for violence?
Yeah. And what was great about it was, he was basically challenged in this notion that the younger generation were this kind of woke generation, that actually there are a lot of tough young men out there and you get them in the army and your job as officers is to sort of shape them and so forth. But I think on the one hand, we want to be kind of very dismissive of our younger generation. But on the other hand, and I see this every time I go into schools, there is something real going on. And I don't think we're even making the effort fully to understand it.
I think, without being unfair to General Sir Patrick, I think he's also talked openly about some of the mental pressures that he felt in the job. And it was an extraordinary speech. I mean, his line was, British soldiers are often, get this, scrawny, ill-educated, and underprivileged, but they have a nobility of spirit, a streak of cheerful and irrepressible defiance, a joyful wildness, and above all, a capacity for sudden violence that, when tempered by disciplines, value, and esprit de corps, makes them amongst the most hard-to-beat soldiers anywhere in the world. And whatever nonsense you hear or see written about a woke generation, I don't recognize it. The soldiers, the friends I've been privileged to serve with these 40 years and whom you're about to command, will scare you to death under pressure and under fire, and sometimes in barracks too.
Yeah. Well, that's the great thing about Rest is Politics Question Time. We can start with me criticizing very rare criticism of my old boss about mental health, and we end up with you reading out a speech from the head of the armed forces. He leaves his job that I spotted on Instagram. Right, Rory, as you know, this episode is powered by Fuse Energy. So I was going through all our questions, and my favorite energy-related question came from Jeff Spink.
Oh, yes.
Does Donald Trump not have a point in trying to get his hands on Greenland, given that the natural resources they have are going to be of enormous benefit to whoever gets their hands on them? I mean, that is a kind of pretty Trumpian transactionalist way of thinking about it, but maybe he does have a point.
Look, it's terrifying, isn't it? I mean, you've seen what's been going on with him saying he's going to make Canada into the 51st state. He's going to grab the Panama Canal. He's having a go at Greenland. And it's very difficult actually to understand what he's doing. And even his supporters struggle to work out where the line is between humor and whatever. But I suppose it's an opportunity to talk a little bit about Greenland. So Greenland really matters. It's a massive US airbase. It's sitting on top of a lot of rare earth minerals. And with climate change and the ice sheet melting around it, it's going to open up new routes between effectively Russia and the United States with massive strategic importance. And in fact, this whole question around the Arctic is something that we haven't talked about enough. We should do maybe a quarter of a program of the main pod on the Arctic someday.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's totally right that if he's thinking about what matters in the near proximity of the US, Panama, Canada, and Greenland are absolutely central. But equally, when you're dealing with a special relationship with your nearest ally, doing that kind of stuff, and then having Elon Musk, your wingman, following up by calling Justin Trudeau a girl because he's tried to step up for Canada and saying, you're not the governor of Canada anymore, girl.
I mean, I was really quite taken with the fact that The Economist, for example, wrote an editorial, Greenlanders should sell up to Donald Trump. And had some really interesting facts in there. Largest deposits of crucial rare earth metals outside China, estimated 52 billion barrels of oil, reserves relatively untapped. And as you say, the climate change is meaning that they're going to be more accessible. So we shall see, but every country in the world is going to be looking at how they meet their own energy needs. And it's a very Trumpian way that he's launched this debate.
Anyway, all good conversations around energy because this episode is powered by Fuse Energy. And you should sign up for the Fuse Energy app, which will allow you to get, if you sign up before the end of January, get some merch from you and me, Alastair.
Download it now. Use the referral code politics after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for the terms and conditions and to learn more. Okay, Rory, one of the big things that happened last week, Mark Zuckerberg, and here's a question from Sander in Canada. With recent developments at Meta, Zuckerberg rollback on fact-checking, I'm curious to hear your reflections on some of the things you discussed with Nick Clegg when he joined you on Leading. How should we interpret his nonchalant attitude on the show towards social media's polarizing role and its large political influence? What did you make of the Zuckerberg thing?
It's completely shocking. I mean, it's beyond imagining what Mark Zuckerberg has done. It's not just getting rid of the 40,000 odd fact-checkers because they're not the key to the whole thing. The most desperate thing he's done is to get rid of the basic algorithms which are in place to try to reduce hate speech. And he's also reduced one of the things that Nick Clegg has said, which is a few years ago, they were saying, well, nobody on our feed really is that interested in politics anyway, so we're going to tamper down the politics. He's reversed that as well. So he's basically said that Facebook can now become, again, a highly politicized, unregulated space full of much more extreme hateful views. And it's a complete reversal of the last 9 years of policy at Meta. Nick Clegg, I think, is resigning. I don't know whether it's connected with this, but I would be fascinated to hear what our friend, the former Danish Prime Minister, makes of this. And I wonder whether the board that she serves on for Facebook is even going to continue to exist.
Helle Thorning-Schmidt has been out and about saying she is not a spokesperson for Meta, that the board will continue to monitor what Meta does, that she did express some concerns, but it was, broadly supportive, I'd say. I think Nick Clegg, I think we agree that we probably should have pushed him harder on the whole, when he did say that social media, there's no evidence that social media has contributed to polarization. I mean, even if you could say that before Musk, he definitely can't say that now. And I think it has. I don't think there's any doubt about that. What I thought about the Zuckerberg thing was it was pathetic to watch. I mean, he was basically saying, if you boil it down, the strategy at the heart of it was like, we thought Trump was finished after the first election when he lost to Biden, so we sort of felt it was okay to kick him around the place. But now he's won, and Elon Musk has got really in with him, so I've got to be careful. I've got to get in with him as well. And Bezos is the same. And we mentioned that cartoonist who got fired from the Washington Post, or resigned from the Washington Post because they wouldn't allow her to do a cartoon that showed these guys just giving money to this enormous Trump up on a pedestal. But that's what's going on. This, I'm afraid, is oligarchy.
It's the three richest men in the world are now swinging in behind Trump, and Zuckerberg is just giving Trump everything that he wants. And Trump believes that he won the election partly fueled by the hate on Twitter, and he'd like Facebook to become like Twitter, a sort of fantastic echo chamber for his own views.
He's also jumping on this masculine bandwagon thing that you were talking about as well. Saying that we've got to kind of, get the masculine thing going back in the workforce and all this stuff. I mean, it's pathetic to watch. I hope Nick Clegg has resigned because he couldn't stomach it. But, definitely when next I see him, I shall hopefully find out more and report back, Rory.
Well, there's something I'd love us to do, maybe to talk about, which is to get someone really good to interview on the way in which social media is polarizing. There's some fantastic books that have come out over the last 4 or 5 years on exactly this subject. We should lean into it a bit more. Just
on this one, though, before we leave, Rory, Andrew, I applaud Rory's perseverance in refusing to call it X and sticking with Twitter. However, is it not time that Rory switched to Bluesky to make a statement that I'm sure Rest Is Politics listeners would appreciate and they would follow? Now, I'm on both. You haven't migrated yet.
I haven't got onto Bluesky. No, I'm so worried because I'm worried that you go on Bluesky and basically everyone on Bluesky is a kind of progressive, centrist, liberal, and everyone on Twitter is going to end up being from the right, and we'll just end up in two completely excluded echo chambers. It's kind of the worst of everything. And part of the problem is the way in which social media just drives polarization and creates chambers where everybody agrees with you and you have no idea what the other half of the world thinks. So no, I'm digging my heels in at the moment. Question to you from Nicole. How significant is Tulip Siddiq's resignation? Is it going to damage Keir Starmer, and should she have done it earlier?
Any ministerial resignation is not good. I suspect what Keir Starmer's approach will be is that he brought in, when he came in, he campaigned on integrity in public life. When he came in, he strengthened the powers of independent people to investigate. She referred herself when this thing came up. I sort of felt the skids were under her in the last 24 hours or so, because I just sensed that I noticed she wasn't on the front bench when Rachel Reeves was doing questions today. If she was, I didn't see her. And normally the ministers would all sort of sit alongside. I think in the end, these sort of personal scandal type stories, they're very, very difficult for leaders to manage, because on the one hand, you want to be fair, you want to be reasonable, you want to allow them to sort of make the case, get the facts. But ultimately, if and when they do go, you don't want it to look like they're being driven out by the media. So what do you think?
I think it was damaging, I'm afraid. It's always difficult because Tulip, who I like very much, her aunt was the leader of Bangladesh, and a pretty autocratic leader of Bangladesh. And when I went to see Sheikh Hasina in Dhaka, we talked about Tulip Siddiq quite a lot during our conversation. There was no secret that her niece was a British Member of Parliament, but it does create tensions, does raise issues, this kind of stuff. I talked to you again about the fact that Mohammed Sawar, Anas Sawar's father, who was a Member of Parliament with me, went back to be, I think, the Chief Minister of the Punjab in Pakistan, joined the Pakistani government as a politician. It is always strange that. And I think in this case, she definitely needed to be more careful in accepting things that were linked to her aunt.
Yeah.
Okay, now here's a question from Daniel McGuinn, which is my last one. Perseverance here, by which I think he must mean that he's asked this question a number of times and hasn't managed to get it answered. Why does national insurance exist? Surely it's fairer, easier to understand, and not an unfair tax on employment to have just a single and higher income tax. Plus, it should bring more revenue to the exchequer. Now, I completely agree.
Do you know, as you read that question out, Rory, I thought the reason he's asking this question is because I've heard him say before that this is his view.
This is my view. I am, in fact, Daniel McQuinn. He is my sock puppet. No, that's not true. That's not true. No, national insurance is a total fraud. When we introduced it, the idea was supposed to be it was a pot set aside specifically to pay for our health and social security. But the government never treated it as that. It just raids it and puts it straight into the general income of the government. So it is a form of income tax. We might as well recognize that it's a form of income tax, be honest about what the real tax rate is, and simplifying tax would make a huge difference. The problem is that Rachel Reeves, I think, is gun shy. I think she's so scared by the adverse reaction she got to trying to deal with the winter fuel allowance and dealing with inheritance tax with farmers that she doesn't really have the appetite for the kind of tax reforms she should be using her majority to drive through. And I think that's partly about timing. If she had made the winter fuel allowance, as you suggested, part of a bigger package of measures, if she'd been smarter about, taxing the winter fuel allowance or something that could have dealt with these cliff edges, she'd be in a much stronger position. But what I'm worried about is that there are now things just desperately need to be done in terms of getting rid of stamp duty, reforming our tax system, which she's just not going to do because she's had these bad experiences over the last 7 months. She needs to be brave.
Yeah. The first introduction of national insurance was in 1911, and it was really about helping people in sort of absolute poverty. There was a gentleman by the name of William Martin Smith, Rory, who had
Yes.
I don't know if I know my national insurance number off the top of my head. It's bizarre, but I do.
Well, don't tell us because we'll all use it.
I'm not going to.
defraud you.
I won't. But and it's bizarre. The reason it's bizarre is I'm normally not good at keeping anything administrative in my head. But William Martin Smith, do you know what his national insurance number was?
No.
A1.
Very good. A1.
Cool.
That's very
a good
cool.
one. But basically, the questioner is right. It's the purpose of national insurance today, I would argue, is very different. It was, by the way, it was expanded hugely by Attlee as part of the welfare state. But I think you're right that in terms of the overall tax debate, that's kind of morphed. Now, my final question, Rory, it's a sort of serious subject, serious question. Cian Haynes, if you were Prime Minister, what would be your plan of action in response to the grooming scandal? Include response to offenders, family bystanders, those involved in cover-up and rebuilding community cohesion. Now, we talked about this last week. We actually got a lot of criticism from certain people last week, including Robert Jenrick went on a bit of a rampage, felt that we were far too soft and far too liberal, I guess. So there you are, Rory. You're Prime Minister. What would you do?
First thing is to just be clear with listeners who felt that I had not been brutal and explicit enough about what was happening with the grooming gangs. It is a horrifying, really, really horrifying story because it's a story which begins with predominantly Pakistani men targeting young, predominantly white girls in many different towns around Britain. And what began with conversations in parks became that individual raping the underage girl, and then became that individual then getting other men to rape that underage girl and trafficking girls through these gangs and networks into other towns, and horrifying stories of abuse involving, in some cases, more than 1,000 victims. What I suppose I still, though, keep trying to say is that The problem is the way that this is being weaponized.
Mm.
This abuse, the majority of it happened between 1997 and 2012. In other words, we're talking, in the cases that have been well documented in these reports, are cases that happened some time ago. There were some very, very evil men involved, but we're talking about a limited number of men. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands of Muslims in the way that some commentators seem to be suggesting. And it's unbelievably dangerous because Musk is deliberately stirring up these cases as a way of echoing far-right activists like Tommy Robinson or the AfD in Germany or the Austrian far-right, who are looking for an excuse to say that Muslims, all Muslims, don't belong in our country, should be remigrated, should be sent home. You know, we talked in the last part about Martin Sellner, who has these theories that there should be only 800 Afghans in Germany instead of 800,000. And I've got a lot of admiration for the way that Keir Starmer, much better than I've managed to do, has found how to articulate this, how to articulate real disgust and horror at the way that young women were let down, at the way that evil men were allowed to perpetrate this, at the way that the state completely failed to cope, the way that social services weren't listened to, the way that police ignored witnesses. The Crown Prosecution Service didn't take witnesses' statements as credible enough to continue with prosecutions. It was all far too slow. And it's a real shame on the state, while at the same time saying this must be approached as a criminal issue and be about improving the way that we support victims and target these kinds of crimes rather than turning it into some racist witch hunt against Muslims.
Yeah, that's twice this week, Roy, that you've said very praiseworthy things about Keir Starmer at a time when an awful lot of commentators are going in the opposite direction. And I wonder if, I mentioned this in the main podcast, I wonder if Tom Baldwin's onto something with this thing about Keir Starmer speaking to the people who aren't abusing and shouting at each other on social media. Because while you were talking, I mentioned the Robert Jenrick thing. Robert Jenrick has done an 11-tweet post, a thread of 11 tweets going through what we said. And I think particularly what you said, although, you know, given that I named him the worst politician of 2024, he probably doesn't like me very much. But so he starts off, for example, he says that the podcast, our discussion, was littered with factual inaccuracies. They downplay the most appalling sexual abuse imaginable. Now, the first point of that, you have to deal with fact. If you're accusing us of factual inaccuracy, then it says they're downplaying. They can say he's entitled to say that's his opinion. He's entitled to say that. What we were actually talking about was, in part, the weaponization of this by people like Elon Musk, by people like Tommy Robinson, etc., and I would argue by Jenrick as well. They claim the abuse only took place in Rotherham and Rochdale, says Jenrick. Well, we didn't. These rape gangs, he says, exist in at least 50 towns and cities across the entire country. See this investigation, puts a link to it. They claim these gangs only operated between 1997 and 2013. I can remember you saying, as you just did, that this was, we're going back to 1997. They claim girls aged 13 to 17 were paid for sex. Some were, he said, most were not. You didn't say that every single girl involved in this was paid for sex. And so it goes on. So this is what I mean about you either want to have a serious, informed, grown-up debate, or you want to be one of the 20% of people. And I'm afraid this is where I think Kemi Badenoch's going wrong. She seems to think that Twitter is real life. She seems to think that is where you conduct the debate. It's part of it. So I think, you know, we should maybe put Jenrick's thing in the newsletter and people can say, alongside the actual discussion, and say whether he thinks, whether people can see whether they think this is a reasonable response. And also, you and I were not saying every single person who calls this out is, quotes, far right, but we were saying that there are people on the far right who are now determined to weaponize this as a way of damaging Keir Starmer. And one of those people happens to own Twitter, happens to be the richest person in the world. That is not saying that every single person who cares about this and worries about this is somehow far right, because an awful lot of people, I think we said a lot of people in the, on the left of politics are just as worried about this.
Yeah. And what is it? What is it that made me angry about what Robert Jenrick said, specifically this. What he had said on Twitter is, this appalling affair is the final nail in the coffin for liberals who still cling to the argument that Britain is an integration success story. The scandal started with the onset of mass migration importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women brought us here. Now, I find that chilling, absolutely chilling. This is not about hundreds of thousands of people, and trying to link this horrifying sex abuse and the actions of those individuals to, presumably by hundreds of thousands of people with medieval attitudes towards women from alien cultures, he basically means people from Pakistan, people from Bangladesh, and Muslims in general. And this directly echoes and resonates and amplifies the language of Tommy Robinson and the AfD and the Austrian far right. And I'm so disturbed that a leading conservative can say that. But the bigger point is this: do not weaponize the horrifying actions of these individuals and try to turn it into a myth that somehow fundamentally Islam is evil, it's a medieval culture, and still less feed into the narratives of people who want to deport. And of course, he then goes on to say, he believes that foreign national offenders should be deported, which is fine. But this conversation about foreign nationals deported is getting closer and closer to the views of the far right in Germany and Austria, who are now arguing that Muslims who are Austrian nationals and German nationals should be deported.
I don't know whether he listens or whether it's just yet another thing that he sort of jumps on because he can use it to weaponize and help his own sort of profiling in this on this issue and in this area. There we are. Lovely to talk to you as ever, Rory. Speak again next week.
Speak soon. Bye-bye.